All right, I think I'd like to begin. We have a great turnout. Thanks, everyone, and welcome. I see a lot of people from coast to coast across the country, which is great. Can't get together in person. At least we can get together online and have a nice chat about what we all enjoy. So my name's Randy Abbott. I'm the president of the Mississauga Center, and tonight is what we call a potpourri night. And normally we have some short talks by members, but what we thought we would do is have a special night. We've invited Trevor Jones of AstroBackyard fame just down the highway in St. Catharines to talk to us about astrophotography, and specifically, for ideas for members and how you can get the most out of your equipment, and even do some astrophotography from the city. And of course, here in lovely Mississauga, Greater Toronto area, we've got to deal with all the light pollution. So very envious of people in, say, Winnipeg and Regina and Calgary who can drive south and find a dark sky. But anyway, we have what we have. So what we will do tonight is we'll get right into our talk. For those of you familiar with chat, if you could, if you have any questions during the talk, put your questions into the chat, and then we'll refer to them afterwards. So with that, I would like to introduce our speaker, Trevor Jones. And if you haven't visited his website, AstroBackyard, please do. It's a great website. Trevor's been an astrophotographer, amateur astronomer for about 10 years, and has come a long way. He's one of those people that just, I think, naturally takes to the hobby and knows how to use equipment, probably spends long hours, like all of us, becoming familiar with the equipment, but then spending the long hours out under the night sky and perfecting his craft. So the talk is called Deep Space Astrophotography, Proven Methods for Better Images. And with that, Trevor, I'd like to invite you to take over, share your screen, and talk to us about deep sky astrophotography.
Sounds good. Thank you, Randy. Can you hear me okay? Everything looks good?
Looks good. Everything's
okay,
great.
Great. Perfect. First of all, thank you all so much for having me here. As Randy mentioned, I'm just on the highway. I'm in St. Catharines. So we share a lot of the same weather patterns, of course, but I'm also in plenty of light pollution here in Niagara, which you are all very used to. So not only will I be talking about astrophotography, deep sky astrophotography, and how you can improve your images, but from the standpoint of someone that does a lot of this from my backyard in the city. So hopefully this is practical advice for you all. So what I'm hoping that you will all get out of this presentation is you'll see that it's possible to capture nebulae and galaxies and city light pollution. I'm in a Bortle scale class 7 for my backyard, to be exact. some best practices for better results in less time. You know, as you know, clear nights can be limited, especially this time of year. So you really want to maximize your results in the chances that you do get. Some methods of capturing and processing deep sky images. That's a huge part of the hobby that you know, beginners don't always think about right off the bat is the image processing side of things. And then some examples of the equipment I use, just so you can get a better idea of, you know, the tools I use and the results I'm getting. I think everybody else is muted. I am hearing a few random noises. Randy, is that the case? Is everyone else muted?
I'll get them for you.
Okay, no problem. Perfect. So yeah, there's a recent image of the Rosette Nebula there on the right, and then me and my telescope there on the left. So there's a little preview of what my backyard sky looks like. That was in the spring of last year. So just a little bit about me, so you know who's talking. You know, a lot of people know me as AstroBackyard, which was kind of just the name I gave my social media presence about 6 years ago. So as I said, most of my photography is in my light polluted backyard. I started in 2010. And then a big part of how a lot of people know me is the AstroBackyard website and YouTube channel, which has been a labor of love over several years now. As of 2019, this is my full-time career. So I'm an amateur astrophotographer, but I'm professional in the way that this is how I make my living, just sharing information like what I'm going to be giving you guys in this talk. So I was fortunate enough to be the instructor for Canadian Astrophotography School in 2019. That was a real honor, and that was a great time. And I got my first NASA astronomy picture of the day, the APOD, in 2020, and that was quite the feather in my cap. It was something that I dreamt of early on, you know, when starting my astrophotography journey. YouTube gives creators a silver play button once you hit 100,000 subscribers, and that was another milestone in my journey that I was quite proud of. And currently I'm a judge for probably too many astrophotography competitions. There's, you know, several going on at once, including one that's wrapping up today. Actually, just finished my voting yesterday. But it's so fun to be so surrounded by you know, a hobby that I love so much. It really is a dream job. So I consider myself a die-hard astrophotographer. I don't know where you are on the spectrum of astrophotography. If you're a beginner, just, you know, taking photos with your cell phone, or if you've got a full-on robust imaging platform and monochrome cameras and a personal observatory. I know at least one member in here has a personal observatory. So I refuse to let light pollution stop me from imaging in the city. As nice as it would be to shoot under dark skies, you know, like they have in some parts of the world, the reality is it's most practical to just step out my door into the backyard and do my photography there. So I try to make it work. I base all of my you know, plans around clear nights and the moon phase. So I really am you know, addicted to this hobby of astrophotography. Planetary photography is something new that I've been exploring. It requires a new type of setup. And sorry, excuse me while I just flick that light back on. So those are some recent images of planets that I've just been recently exploring. Okay. The backyard I shoot in, there's a, you know, that's what it looks like, you know, perhaps, you know, similar looking to many of your backyards. You know, my dog Rudy there, that was my lawn is looking great there. It was the spring. It doesn't look like that anymore, but it is light polluted, and, you know, it's a challenging environment to photograph the night sky, to be honest, compared to, you know, some places in the world, but it's also home. So it's fun. So here's some of my, you know, better images, and all of these were captured from the backyard. So, you know, for anyone that thinks that it's not possible to capture these beautiful, detailed images in city light pollution is wrong. It just, you know, it's all about the approach you take, and, you know, it's mostly about the approach and the planning, not so much about the expensive gear, which is an eye-opener for a lot of people, I think. So I like to think of it as, smart imaging, and that comes down to the planning and the acquisition period and careful image processing. So planning involves the right subject for your equipment, imaging conditions, and the moon phase. And, it might be obvious to the seasoned vets, the types of projects that you should be attempting depending on the weather and your conditions and your gear. But to beginners, it's not so obvious. As an example of this, a broad spectrum full color target that's a dim reflection nebula, something like the Iris Nebula, that's a real tall order from a light polluted backyard sky. That's the type of project you probably want to save for traveling to a dark sky area, whereas capturing the Orion Nebula or the Rosette Nebula, something very bright with a hydrogen alpha filter, that's totally something that's approachable from the city. And those are the types of decision-making process that you need to make. So the acquisition stage, you also need to think about the exposure lengths, the types of filters that you want to use, and the timing of these projects. And then in the image processing side of things, the gradient extraction is something that's kind of a hurdle to overcome early on. The color balancing and the selective stretching. So the image processing side of things is like an entirely different animal than the image acquisition. And I think you'll find that with new astrophotographers, they usually excel in at least one side of things, whether they're kind of technically savvy, they're good with setting up the telescope and capturing great data, but they're not so great at processing, or vice versa. And kind of where I stood at the beginning was, as a previous graphic designer, I was pretty comfortable with Adobe Photoshop and playing with image data, but I wasn't so great with telescopes, and astronomy was a new hobby to me. So everyone's at a different level. So this is an example image here of the Horsehead Nebula and Flame Nebula. This is a recent image I took, and I just wanted to talk about what went right in this image. So to start in the planning stages, I studied example images of what my ideal version of this image would look like. So, I was inspired by images of the Horsehead and Flame Nebula that had this kind of style of look to it, in terms of the color and detail and the framing. So before I even started this project, I kind of knew what I wanted it to look like. So this is an HA-RGB palette image, and I'll explain what that means shortly. So for this particular image, a narrowband filter was used, specifically a 3 nanometer HA filter, to add impactful details to the subject. So it's multiple years worth of color data collected during the new moon phase, and that comes into the planning side of things. And then with that, impactful hydrogen alpha filter data on top of it. So knowing to plan the image that way for my intended look is something that didn't happen overnight. It was a lot of planning and studying what others have done successfully to get to this point. As you can see, there's a lot going on in this frame: the Flame Nebula and the Horsehead Nebula and those stars and some reflection nebulosity, all those things going on. So the framing was critical, getting that right to produce the image that I was hoping to get. Luckily, it all came together. And then lastly, there was a lengthy image processing session to steer the image into my ideal version. So in this case, there happens to be a very bright star within the field of view, Alnitak. And so I had to reduce the size of that star in the image processing to get the type of image that I was looking for. I also had to really boost those blues and use that hydrogen alpha luminance data to get the level of detail that I was hoping for. And if it doesn't make sense now, I'll get into the more of the specifics shortly. Here's another example of an image that went right, and this one is in the Hubble palette, or the SHO palette. So the target location for my backyard sky, it cleared all the obstructions. I was able to get plenty of exposure time on it to do the object justice. And the target size and type was a great match for the gear that I was using. And all these things aren't so obvious as you're starting out. You might attempt an object that just requires way too much integration or exposure time to process out a great image, and you don't know that stuff early on. So the best advice I have there is to look what others are doing, and to try and mimic or mirror their approach. And then at least you'll know that, you know, an image like that is possible using the gear that you're using. So this one happened to be on a monochrome camera and a wide field refractor. I was able to capture these sharp, high resolution details. And all of that is because I did the planning beforehand, saying, okay, you know what, this is how big this object's going to be in the field of view of my telescope. And I've seen that others, to produce this style of image, use these filters, they use this palette. And so you kind of know what you're getting into, if it's a practical choice or not. So the first thing to ask yourself, if you are imaging from the city, is it possible to image this object from the city successfully? Because it's not like you can just say, okay, well, what do I want to photograph tonight? You know, I can pick anything. Certain things are a practical choice, and others are not even worth, you know, banging your head against the wall. Like I spoke about earlier with those dim reflection nebulae, they can be a real challenge, no matter what type of filter you have. Milky Way photos, faint reflection nebulae are really, really difficult from the city. So I wouldn't suggest trying to take those types of shots from a city backyard. Are you going to need 20 to 30 hours of exposure time? Is it so faint that you just really need to pour on the images that you take to produce you know, a nice image? Or is it something like the Orion Nebula, where you can capture, you know, a bunch of 30-second exposures and get a really exciting, beautiful image out of it? So those are the types of things you need to look into before diving into a deep sky project. So when it comes to planning, one of the simple tools I like to use is it's called Stellarium, which is a planetarium software tool. It's free. I'm sure many of you already use it. It's still my favorite. I've been using it for many years. You can actually overlay a picture of your own backyard into it, and it will outline you know, the horizon line for your backyard, which is great for planning. So when I'm looking at Stellarium, I can set the exact date and time for an upcoming clear night and say, okay, the Rosette Nebula will clear my house by 9 p.m. and it's going to run into my tree by, you know, 2 a.m. So that gives me that window of opportunity to shoot it. Not only that, but there's a sensor view where you actually punch in your exact telescope magnification and the size of your camera sensor, and it will show you the exact framing of your, you know, of a future project. So you can say, okay, well, this is a good fit for my gear, and I can see that through this sensor view. So all of that is really great for planning, and I don't start any new project without running through this process first. You can also see where the moon is going to be in the sky. You wouldn't want to shoot directly into the moon or near it. You want to avoid the moon for deep sky astrophotography in general. So that's always great to see. And then, yeah, so you can not only planning for a single night, but you can say, okay, what's coming up in the future? Is this a project I can start now and complete in 2 weeks? Or is it something that, you know, I'll have to chip away at over multiple years? You know, and some of those winter projects can take that long because you get these small windows of opportunity. But the planning is key, and having a game plan will help you avoid wasting time and potentially getting frustrated. So multi-bandpass narrowband filters are something that haven't been around for a whole long time. Really, in the last 3 years or so, a lot of people are using them for astrophotography. And they're great specifically because you can use them with a color camera and collect these really amazing images in a relatively short amount of time, as opposed to shooting through a monochrome camera and separate filters and building these images. You get a pretty gratifying image kind of out of the box. So a one-night project, you can get these really great images. So I highly suggest, if you're using a color camera or a DSLR, to look into these multi-bandpass narrowband filters. There's some great ones out there. The Optolong L Extreme is a good one, and the OPT, or the Radian Triad Ultra filter. Here's two example images shot with those filters, and those are both from the backyard. And I should mention, the way these work, it's a very selective bandpass of light that it's allowing the camera to pass through to the sensor. So you're blocking out a large portion of the light pollution and the unwanted light that you don't want to capture on your camera, and you're filtering in just those important, impactful details of the subject you're capturing. So whether that's hydrogen or sulfur or oxygen, it's pretty magical the way that they kind of filter everything out. So you're left with this kind of hidden nebula behind the light pollution. So broadband imaging, and when I say that, it's the broad spectrum. Instead of narrow band, these narrow band passes on the spectrum, you're capturing the full visible spectrum in a single shot. So your DSLR camera or a one-shot color dedicated astronomy camera, these are the types of cameras you're using for those kinds of shots. When you are shooting the broad spectrum RGB style images, you'll want to shoot during the new moon phase. That moonlight is not doing you any favors. So you might want to use a light pollution filter, a mild light pollution filter, something like the Optolong L Pro, to kind of help you cut through some of that light pollution. Or I've found it's better to shoot without a filter at all and just deal with that, those gradients and light pollution in the image processing. It can be a bit time consuming, but I think you'll find that the natural colors are retained, and they're just kind of buried between a washed out sky in the city. So you may be surprised at what you can capture using a one-shot color camera unfiltered from the city. But of course, if it's really bright, you'll want to keep those exposures very, very short. So when I say that 1 week period to collect your best RGB luminance data, that's the weeks surrounding the new moon phase. So that image there of the Triffid Nebula was captured with my mirrorless camera, a Canon EOS RA, from my Bortle 7 backyard without a filter. And if you're familiar with where this object lies, it's quite low, even at its highest. And it happens to be, the south, when I'm pointed south of my backyard, that's the brightest part of the sky into the light dome. So I just show that to show you the example that, there might be some incredible details buried beneath that washed out sky if you're willing to put in the work in the image processing. Lrgb imaging, on the other hand, so instead of using a one-shot color camera, you use a monochrome camera and shoot through these color filters one at a time, RGB, red, green, blue. And you'd be very surprised at how well this does at actually ignoring light pollution. I remember when I first got my first monochrome camera and RGB filters, I thought, what, am I going to have to stack a light pollution filter in front of it? Like, how does this all work? But because it's filtering out the portion of the spectra where those colors are found, you can actually get away with some pretty impressive broad spectrum imaging using a monochrome camera and RGB filters. Luminance is just basically the white light or the full light of the object. And again, you'll want to shoot that during the new moon phase. So here's an example of the Whirlpool Galaxy captured from my light polluted backyard. And I certainly didn't think that, broadband or broad spectrum imaging like this, of this quality, was possible from the city. So I would urge any of you that are in Bortle 7 or Bortle 8 skies to give it a shot. Lrgb imaging, you might be surprised at how good the data is even in the city. But for certain targets, might want to consider getting out of your backyard to a dark sky site. So the subject here, the Iris Nebula that you see on the right there, was photographed with a color camera and no filter. And you can see a lot of that, faint dust that I just love so much there. And an image like that is pretty well impossible from the city because, any type of filtering isn't going to help you with the really broad spectrum stuff like this. So if you can see on the light pollution map there, I just put a little pin of, approximately where that photo was taken. And I made sure to include Mississauga on the right-hand side. So if you can see that blue area, that's pretty well as dark as it gets around here. And that's about a 3-hour drive for me, but even shorter for you guys in Mississauga. You just want to get somewhere dark, so you can plan these road trips, or in my case, I stay at Airbnbs. I'll spend a few nights in a dark sky spot, and I use that light pollution map to guide me of where I want to be. That setup there, my one-shot color setup, that's just a small refractor telescope and a one-shot color camera on my tracking mount with auto guiding there. So, one of the benefits of shooting unfiltered from a dark sky area in the broad spectrum is that you'll get those really natural looking star colors. That's something that's really hard to do. Impossible to do with narrowband filters, but really hard to replicate done any other way. But this is where you'll want to do stuff like wide angle nightscapes, the Milky Way and galaxies, and a lot of that stuff is best done from a dark sky site if you're able to. Speaking of the Milky Way and wide angle astrophotography, it's not technically deep sky, but a lot of the processes of capturing and processing a wide angle nightscape image is the same as a deep sky image. It's long exposure, tracked images, and the stacking and the processing, a lot of similarities just on a wider scale. But the great thing is you need much less of a robust setup to accomplish this. So a little star tracker, the Skywatcher Star Adventurer shown there, and then a DSLR mirrorless camera and lens, as opposed to, say, a dedicated astronomy camera and a telescope. So it's a much more simplified, basic setup, and it's a lot of fun. The hardest thing for these types of shots is to get somewhere dark during the new moon with great weather, but it could be a lot of fun. So if you've got some summer camping trips and it's going to be dark, plan around the new moon phase and get yourself a star tracker and a nice fast lens. That's one of my favorite lenses. There's the Canon RF 15-35 f2.8. There's several great fast lenses for stuff like this, but it's one of my favorite types of astrophotography, and it's wide angle nightscapes, especially if you start incorporating some foreground details in there too. And anyone already doing landscape photography and daytime photography that's been around the block there will probably start to we'll probably find a lot of interest in that style of astrophotography, but I love it all. So image processing, it's quite astonishing, and for people that are new to the hobby, that it doesn't even seem real that there can be an image like that hidden in that first exposure, or in this case, stack of exposures. But believe it or not, that is what my integrated file of image exposures from the backyard looked like on the left, and then the resulting image on the right of what was actually in there that I was able to pull out in the image processing. It's absolutely incredible. That's the oh boy, what is that? It's not the Squid Nebula. I can't remember what that nebula. Jellyfish. That's the Jellyfish Nebula. So there's a lot of tools. It's an ever-growing list of image processing tools available to astrophotographers these days. You know what? I'm still using a tool called Deep Sky Stacker, which is still supported and updated to combine my data. So, astrophotography involves capturing several long exposure images, and then you use these tools to combine the data to produce an image with a stronger signal to noise ratio, one that's suitable for image processing, as opposed to trying to stretch a single exposure. This is several hours worth of exposure time stacked into one, really great intermediate file. Sequator or Sequitur is a free, Deep Sky Stacker and Sequitur are both free, I should mention. Sequitur is also another tool for image stacking and producing your intermediate file. So when I say registration, it just means aligning all of those image exposures, the stars on top of each other, the integration and calibration. So if you've heard terms like dark frames and flat frames, those are all calibration files that astrophotographers use to help calibrate the image so you have a better, healthier image to start really processing on. Adobe Photoshop, I'm a big fan It's still a very relevant choice in astrophotography in 2022. There's so much you can do with it, so powerful. But if you've never touched Adobe Photoshop, there's a good chance you'll just want to use something like PixInsight, which was actually built exclusively for astrophotography. So it's a start to finish software that has some incredible tools for processing deep sky images. And I like to hop around between both of them because there's certain things I feel more comfortable doing in Adobe Photoshop. Other things PixInsight just does way better or way faster, easier. So, you know, in the end, I think you'll find that you'll use a number of different tools to get the job done. And a lot of it comes down to preference and what you're comfortable with. A few add-ons, Topaz Labs, Denoise AI is kind of relatively new to the scene. And it's quite amazing what it can do in terms of noise reduction, because dealing with noise in images was historically a real pain to deal with in the image processing, but there's so many great tools to help you along with that these days. The Astronomy Tools action set, that's kind of a one-click perform all of these astronomy-specific actions to your photo. I couldn't live without that one. And then StarNet++ was something, again, relatively new that separates the stars from your image, and you're able to process your nebula or galaxy independent from the stars, which is a real game changer in the image processing world. So as for image processing tips for a color broadband RGB image, if ideally you would be using a monochrome camera and those RGB filters like I spoke before. And then if you are going to use a light pollution filter, try something mild like an Optolong L Pro, where it's not really, you know, out of the box, you're never really going to get this high contrast image. So just have faith that there's some great data in there that you'll have to, you know, bring out in the processing. Gradients and color balancing are probably the biggest challenges when shooting broad spectrum data from especially from the city. There's great tools. Gradient Exterminator is a great tool to look into. And then the automatic background extractor tool in PixInsight is a really good one. Randy, I'm hearing someone got unmuted, I think, briefly. And then, so masks are, you know, masks is pretty advanced in terms of the image processing world, but it's something you'll really want to get familiar with as you progress your image processing skills. Narrowband imaging is a really practical choice from the city because it really cancels out almost all of the light pollution, you know, particularly if you're shooting in hydrogen alpha. That's something you can capture images on a full moon night if you want. And in the heaviest of light pollution, narrowband imaging makes a lot of sense. You can create some pretty amazing images. So that's the current monochrome camera I use quite often is the ZWO ASI 2600mm Pro. I should say ZWO. I'm used to speaking to an American audience. And then the filters I use are Chroma 3nm narrowband filters. And that number, that 3 nanometer, is just how narrow that bandpass is. So there's 6 nanometer and 12 nanometer. So, you know, the narrower that bandpass, the less light you're collecting and the more specific it is. But it takes time to build a full image when you're shooting one wavelength at a time like this. So, you know, if you plan on creating a full color image, expect to spend several nights and maybe multiple months to complete a project. But it's definitely worth it. So that's a photo of Melat 15 deep inside of the Heart Nebula in Cassiopeia. And that was done with narrowband filters, one filter at a time over several nights. The really interesting thing, and it kind of, there's a shift that happens when you start this type of photography. If you're used to capturing a full color image in one shot and you switch to narrowband, you really start to look at the data you're collecting in each channel. So, you know, in Photoshop, you can break an image down to the RGB channels and say, okay, how much blue is in this image? How much green? How much red? And when you start to look at an image that way, you can process each channel independently, or in the case of narrowband images, each wavelength of light separately to build this really impressive image. So images like this, the separation between the colors and gases is so dynamic because you're able to pull certain ones up and other ones down to really create that, masterpiece image. And of course, this is the palette that Hubble uses, the Hubble palette as they call it, which I'll break down in this slide here. So what that is the red channel is the sulfur, the S2 filter. The green channel is the hydrogen alpha. And I have a spelling mistake here. The blue channel is supposed to be O3, the oxygen. And those are the actual channels broken down there on the left. And to build that full color image of the, most of the Heart Nebula and Melotte 15 in there. My camera sensor couldn't quite squeeze it all in. But as you can see from that image, it's just, incredibly detailed images that really highlight all of the gases that make up some of these nebulae. It's most effective at nebula like this. Rarely do you ever shoot with those types of filters on a galaxy, and never for reflection nebula. But some of the best, most approachable targets from the city are nebulae like this. So image processing tips for narrowband. One of the big things I think you'll find is that certain wavelengths are so much more powerful than others. Usually, if not always, the hydrogen, it's the most common gas in the universe, and that hydrogen can be really overpowering. So to create the image that's well balanced, you'll probably have to tone down that H alpha channel, the green channel, and really bring up some of the fainter ones like the O3, the oxygen. So back to the planning and the studying the examples of the image that I like. In the case of this Siegel Nebula image, I really wanted those golds and those blues to shine through. So to get an image like that, I really had to bring down the hydrogen and bring up the oxygen to get those blues, and the golds were primarily in the S2. So really playing with those channels to create that final image is so important. So when you are looking into the style of image you want to create, if you find it on Astroband or an APOD image, you can save the image and look at each channel, say, wow, and compare it to your own. Okay, how much signal do they have specifically in that blue channel for it to look like that? Because if you compare it to, say, a version you're working on, it's like, wow, okay, I'm going to need to put 10 more hours of exposure time into the O3 if like my image has a chance to look like the one I want. Because like I said, that hydrogen is so overpowering. And that was a real eye-opener for me when I first started creating these narrowband images, and they were all very, very green looking. Okay, I want to leave lots of time for questions here. So we're almost done. So some ninja processing tips is to combine your multi-band pass images with, say, one of those multi-band pass filters, or your narrowband images with your color images to get them both, getting the best of both worlds if possible. That was kind of an experiment there with the Pillars of Creation, where I attempted to get more of a natural look through, a broadband image with narrowband details kind of added in to create something, really special. There's a tool called Deconvolution that Steve made sure that I included in this presentation. That's probably the best way to actually sharpen an astrophoto, and it really is a magical tool. There's so many great tools in PixInsight, and you can do a lot of them in Photoshop too, but a lot of it is workarounds. And so like I said, it's a balanced approach in multiple softwares to achieve the look you're going for. Something that's so powerful is using layer masks in Photoshop. I know PixInsight does this as well. I'm just not as comfortable with it. But as you can imagine, when you create masks for certain colors or certain areas of the image, you're able to manipulate them independently from everything else. So let's say you want to brighten up or boost the saturation of a certain area of your image, but you definitely don't want to boost the saturation of that background sky and introduce all these new artifacts of like a green sky or anything. So to be able to separate your image into the parts that you want to adjust independently is so key to having full control over your image. StarNet, lastly, is one of those things where, stars are one of the hardest things to process in your image, especially if you're trying to boost certain areas without making your stars bigger or more bloated. You really want to leave those stars as they are, or perhaps even shrink them, so you can really kind of reveal the interesting structure of the nebula behind it. Because anytime you reduce the stars and bring up the nebula, you're really showcasing the detail of the nebula. Certain ones, stars look great, but it's just easier to see those deep sky objects sometimes when you kind of, either remove the stars, put them back in, or reduce them a little bit. But that's getting pretty advanced. Lastly, this is kind of where I'm at right now. Okay, I was going to say, why is there a picture of Rudy right there? But I named my observatory the Black Dog Observatory. So that's kind of where I'm at now. I mean, a 10-year journey from my DSLR camera and a little telescope to having a personal observatory where I can, really do these long-term projects. It was a dream come true. So just thought I'd throw that in there just so you can see kind of where my journey is at right now. But that wraps up my slides, and I see 23 next to the chat. So I assume there's some questions now that I'd love to answer.
Great, thank you very much, Trevor. Yeah, there's some questions here, so let's go through it. Okay, one person, putting your backyardscape into Stellarium is pretty cool. Someone's asking for a little bit more information on how to do that.
I was hoping that would come up. So the first time I saw someone do this, I was like, oh, okay, wow, I need to do that. It's really helpful. I watched a YouTube tutorial. So if you type in the YouTube search how to put your backyard in Stellarium, you'll find great tutorials. There's dozens now, but it involves taking a panoramic photo. I just took it with my phone because it has that panoramic mode, and you do a 360 to take that photo. And then there's a bit of cutting in Photoshop. You have to kind of crop the sky out, and it just allows you to import this image, this 360 panorama of your backyard. And there's some adjusting to get the horizon right. But once it's in there, it's there for good, and it's so handy. So a bit of work up front, expect it to take about a half an hour to an hour or so, but then it's there, and it's really handy. So yeah, just watch a YouTube tutorial. That's probably the best way to get that done.
Yeah, that's very impressive. I like that. Someone's asking, can you align an equatorial mount without being able to see Polaris? That is, if it's blocked by a wall or something. Yeah,
so I've been so lucky that we're in our second house now, and both had a clear view of Polaris. And I've always sworn by even my manual method of polar aligning my telescope mounts using Polaris as an aid. But of course, that's not the case for a lot of people. There's a lot of the tools now will have a method of using other stars to tell you if you're polar aligned or not. It's called drift alignment. And basically what it does is saying it's going to need to see the pictures. You have to take some test exposures through your camera saying, okay, if this star is here now, I kind of know where I am. It plate solves the image, and it will it'll give you hints of which way you need to adjust the ALTAS to get it polar aligned. So that's something, it is a little more challenging, but there's tools in software like SharpCap and many others to help you get this done. And I suppose if it is a bit of a task, you might want to leave that telescope set up and polar aligned for as long as possible to save you from doing it again. But I don't think it's that bad because a lot of people are in that position.
Okay, great. Yeah, so someone was asking about a lot of information in your talk, Trevor. So we are going to post this talk online so people can go back and refer to it and pick up all those great tidbits. Also, Gary posted that there is a site called macobservatory.com, which has information for people who are looking for astronomy software for their Macs. John has a question about dialing oxygen or hydrogen up or down to achieve a dramatic color shot. Is this the real world nebula we're seeing, or do we think of it as color-coded, as it were? Beautiful, but not truly representative. So I guess he's saying, with all these beautiful pictures, is that really what one would see if you were just a few million light years away from it, I guess?
Yeah, no, I mean, in general, our eyes could never see this much light. Of course, we're using the magic of cameras to just soak in those photons for hours on end. But yeah, no, it's very artistic, and we balance out those colors so we're able to separate the gases, and we're able to see a great representation of the nebula. But no, of course, if it was just straight 2 hours of hydrogen and 2 hours of oxygen, if you say that's the natural level, it's way off. It's so skewed into the hydrogen. So everything would look in this palette extremely green, extremely pumped full of hydrogen, and everything else would just be buried. So it's definitely an artistic approach to balance things out so we can better see the structure in each gas from each other. And it is really beautiful. So you could explore this type of imaging and just leave everything as it is, but you'll quickly find that just the hydrogen dominates, and it's nice to see the S2 and O3 shine through.
Okay, next question. Interesting. Christopher is asking about the names like Jellyfish Nebula and Running Man and where they came from.
Oh boy, I wish I knew. Some of them have, some of the nicknames are newer, and I would expect most of them are pretty old when they were first discovered. Many of them that don't really resemble what they look like in images were named, through a visual observation too. So ones like the Dumbbell Nebula and stuff, you kind of see it, but other ones are kind of harder to really relate to. But yeah, I'm under the understanding that they were named during the observation period, first discovery, and also, early images, and then those names kind of stuck. But a lot of them have several nicknames, and I just kind of roll with them.
Yeah, no, I think the crab is a perfect example. I never see a crab, but then you look at a really, really old drawing that someone made, and oh yeah, that looks like a crab.
Right.
So a question for a novice. What would you suggest for your first astrophotography processing software, PixInsight or Photoshop?
Whew. I would say Photoshop, but I mean, I think of as Photoshop as one of those tools that most people have had some experience with it, so it's comfortable to them. Whereas PixInsight can be really daunting, at least when you first open it up. But that's not for everyone. So if Photoshop is daunting to you and you've never used that software, you're probably better off, if you're going to invest time learning something from scratch and you're only interested in astrophotography, PixInsight is probably a better option for you. But for PixInsight, you'll definitely want to get some books and watch some tutorials. Thankfully, there's a lot available these days to kind of get you through. That's what I did personally. So it depends, but I would consider Photoshop a little more user-friendly, but that's just, I might be biased on that.
Yeah, and along that line, someone is asking you to share your PixInsight workflow on your channel.
So I did about 3 or 4 months ago, I did my full astro imaging processing tutorial that involved a bit of Photoshop and a bit of PixInsight. And the reality is, for me right now, there's only certain things I do in PixInsight because they do it so well, and then I bring the image back into Photoshop where I'm comfortable to make kind of the important decisions. But stuff like the gradient extraction, the star removal, the sharpening through deconvolution, there's a tool that removes the green from your images. There's a bunch of great tools that I use. So you know what, I'm not the be-all end-all expert on PixInsight by a long shot. But there's some great, I would recommend Sean Nielsen's Visible Dark Astro channel if you're into PixInsight. He has some incredible tutorials, and he's local. He's in Kitchener, and a friend of mine. Okay,
moving on. Someone's got an f11 camera lens, a new Canon 800mm f11 on the R system in Bortle 8 Sky. Do you have any tips for this person?
Wow, yeah, that's a very new lens. I was interested about that. 800mm. So 800mm is like a telescope focal length, which is great. You'll need tracking, that's for sure. You'll need and probably not well, definitely not a star tracker, something, because that's a heavy lens. You'll need a telescope equatorial mount with tracking to use that lens to capture long exposure images. And f11 is I mean, you won't find many telescopes or refractors, which is the closest thing to a lens, at f11. They're more of the f5, f6. So you'll want to shoot something very bright. I would definitely start with the Orion Nebula at this time of year, and maybe practice on the moon, these bright objects, because that's a pretty slow lens. I don't know that they intended that to be used for astrophotography, but that's not to say it couldn't be done. But you'll want to stick to the brighter targets and make sure that tracking is really on, because you'll need to take 30 second to a minute exposures, even on the Orion Nebula, at a minimum at f11 to get enough light to play with an image.
Yeah. Okay, here's an interesting question. Have you had issues with Starlink or other satellites? How do you see this as an issue in the future, and how do you remove those things from your photos?
So the removal of them is pretty easy. The stacking software actually handles that. There's an algorithm that will reject anything with satellite trails in it. So it's not a huge issue for astrophotographers currently, just because of the way we process images. I will say that the idea of looking up at the sky from a dark sky site and seeing hundreds of satellites makes me, almost makes me sick, because it's to spoil the natural beauty of our night sky. And we really everyone should get to see an unspoiled night sky, and that's going to be harder and harder to come by. So it's a bit sad. I don't want to be a hypocrite, because I use modern technology, and I'll use probably internet that was delivered through Starlink at some point in my life, but it's not an issue with dealing with for astrophotography. But there's a much greater issue at play there, especially when you consider that it's all of our night sky, and a small group of people are calling the shots on what that's going to look like in the future. It's kind of a scary thought.
Yeah, I can't agree with you more there. Someone's asking if you offer one-on-one tutorials, or when we can get together. Do you offer those services?
I don't, but I try to do stuff that tutorials on my YouTube channel, in my image processing guide, where you can kind of hopefully learn that way, because it's just too hard for me to do one-on-one from a time perspective. So I try to answer all of the questions I get from those types of situations, and reveal that to a large audience whenever possible, to hopefully answer hundreds of questions at once, as opposed to one-on-one. So I apologize, I don't do one-on-one, but I try to get around to that information on a broader scale.
Okay, what's the best way to capture galaxies with an OSC camera? I hope I'm reading that right, from light polluted skies.
Yeah, so this one happens to be Lrgb. So the best galaxies, I would say, you'll want to shoot shorter exposures, lots of shorter exposures. It's the ongoing debate of whether it's better to take long exposures versus short. But what you'll find when you're shooting a broad spectrum target like a galaxy from the city is that your image will get oversaturated because it's so bright in a very short period of time. So what a lot of astrophotographers do will shoot 30 or 60-second exposures on a galaxy and just use that overall integration to get to that 3 or 4 hour mark. I probably try to shoot unfiltered or a really mild light pollution filter for a galaxy if you want to capture that natural look. So yeah, shorter exposures, plenty of focal length if you can, because a lot of them are very small. But yeah, it's quite a tall task to capture a really full-colored, beautiful galaxy from the city. So it's definitely something you might want to save for those dark sky trips as well.
Okay, how do you determine how long to expose a target to ensure you have enough data for a good photo?
Yeah, so you can really use the histogram. There's other, a lot of these image acquisition software will tell you, a readout of information about the image, how big your stars are, how bright the background sky is. But really, you can use the histogram, which is, very simple to use. if the histogram shows, and I don't believe I actually have one on here, if you're clipping the data to one side or the other, if the image is too dark, you'll see it, all the data is kind of clipped into the shadows, or if it's too bright, which is more common of a case, it's hitting the right-hand side of the image. So if you're clipping data on either side of that histogram, and it's just a representation of the light you've collected, then there's a problem. You want to get the majority of the data in the close to the middle of that histogram, and know that no matter what that sub-exposure looks like, you've captured some quality data in there, but it's going to take some image processing to really balance out.
Okay, a little bit of a technical question here. Is automating your image taking with a Raspberry Pi or an ASI Air and your phone more rewarding than using a whole laptop on the back end? I've used several laptops outside in conditions, and they're not in conditions they're not recommended for.
Yeah, me too. I mean, I used a laptop in a Rubbermaid bucket turned sideways for many years, and recently the ASI Air, I've come around, and it is really nice to control the entire imaging session on your phone. I was worried at first that I wouldn't have the type of control that I would have with my laptop running my image acquisition software, my auto guiding software, and everything. But devices like the ASI Air are they've ironed out a lot of the kinks, and it is a pretty seamless experience. And it almost doesn't seem fair of how great of a job it does at the whole process. So if you're looking to kind of streamline the experience and cut down on the amount of gear and go inside while you're imaging, the ASI Air is really tough to beat. And yeah, I'm a fan now after hesitantly jumping on board from my old school methods of having the laptop in full control.
How do you determine a guiding interval?
A guiding interval. I'm wondering if that's the exposure time between guide frames, because for anyone that doesn't,
the number, how in between, how many times the guider actually checks to see the position of the star.
Oh, okay. So I mean, for anyone that's new to the hobby, auto guiding is essentially looking at, it's like a video, but the exposures are about 2 seconds long, and you have this separate telescope riding on top of your imaging scope that is looking at a star, and it's measuring the movement that it makes and sending information to your telescope mount to adjust it to stay kind of locked on target. And thus you're able to shoot these long exposure images because the tracking on your mount is improved. So there's a lot of trial and error with auto guiding. I found I use 2-second exposures through my little guide scope. I think people really try to overthink the whole auto guiding experience, but with programs like PhD2 guiding and the guiding tool in the ASI Air, it really makes it easy just using the kind of general settings to get started. And then after that, don't go crazy with the tweaking with your auto guiding. A big thing is too, if you take a 5-minute exposure and you look at it and you're capturing sharp stars, but your guiding graph, you're over analyzing it, you want to make it even better, there's no point in trying to get it better if you're taking sharp images that are 5 minutes long. So that's the only advice I have there for auto guiding.
Okay, the person with the question actually meant, I misinterpreted, he meant the actual exposure time. So how do you determine how long your exposure should be?
For the guiding, or for your
looking at the histogram and seeing what data you're getting for each photo.
Yeah, and just it's as a general rule of thumb, if I'm shooting images in the backyard in the bright city light pollution with an RGB camera, my exposures are 2 to 3 minutes each, and that's through like an f5, f6 telescope. If I'm shooting narrowband, they're usually about 5 or 6 minutes each. And then from a dark sky site, those full color images without a filter can go much longer. But I feel like for color images, I don't see much of a need to go past 3 minutes, and narrowband around 5 minutes. But you'll find, people with CCD cameras and really robust imaging systems shooting 10 or 20-minute exposures. That's really demanding on your telescope mount and the tracking accuracy. But if you can do 5 minutes, you can pretty well do anything.
Trevor, you've done a great job building your astro career using social media. Which platform, and he lists three here, YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, have you found to be the most effective in getting your message out and connecting with your audience?
YouTube by a landslide. So, all of these other, I mean, now in TikTok is really popular, and there's a lot of astrophotographers on there. I found personally, I wasn't able to communicate with my audience unless I had a full, 10-minute video of really bringing the viewer along with me as I go through, sharing these little moments and realities of being a backyard astrophotographer. You can't, on Instagram, if you're just looking at someone's images and maybe a picture of their gear, that's great, but you don't really get an idea for what's actually happening until you really come along for the full journey. So YouTube was definitely, how I became where I am. It's probably the most work too in terms of content creation, but I really enjoy, the storytelling and bringing people along for my journey. So for me, YouTube was the ticket. And I've seen so many great startup YouTube channels now that are literally that. It's just, come with me in the backyard for a night of astrophotography. And it's so enjoyable and relatable to see these people and their, and just follow them in the backyard. It's great.
Trevor, I recently acquired the OPT Radian Triad Ultra Narrowband filter for emission nebulae. Do you think this is a good narrowband filter to start with?
Yeah, I mean, that's probably one of the best. I find it just a little bit better than the Optolong L Extreme. It's an expensive filter, but it does such a great job. If I can just, okay, so there's an example of it, of the Elephant's Trunk Nebula in IC 1396 with that filter. So to be able to capture, nebulae like this in that kind of detail from the city is really magical. So the fact that we have these filters that are so advanced, the bandpass technology to really separate those out for us in one-shot color, it really is a gift. So, and realize that this wasn't possible even a few years ago. That filter specifically is one of my favorites to use from the city.
Okay, this is a good question. How much storage have you used for all your astrophotography photos, given the number of years you're doing this? And how do you store them? Do you store them in the cloud, local storage server? Any recommendations?
A bit of everything. That's such a great question. So I have an 8 terabyte drive here that's pretty well full because I do keep all of the image data that I've collected throughout the years. I really don't throw away pretty well anything, because you'd be surprised at what you want to go back to, even if you're not going to use it to create your next image, just for comparison to see. So yeah, it does eat up a lot of room. So my current camera that I use all the time, that ASI 2600, each image exposure is about 50 megabytes. So that adds up quickly, especially if you're doing these projects that are 2-minute exposures and you capture 150 of them. That's a lot of data. I still like to have it on a local hard drive, an SSD if possible, a Samsung T7 SSD drive. That's my favorite because the data transfer is so fast. Cloud storage is great and it's convenient because I'm here in my office or at home, I can access the data, but the lag between transferring those files gets to me sometimes. So and then of course you want things backed up in multiple places, because we work so hard for this data. The last thing you want to do is lose it to file corruption, and that has happened to me. It's heartbreaking.
Here's a question from David. I'm a pretty good landscape photographer. Should I focus on nightscapes like the Milky Way as a first step toward astrophotography?
I absolutely would, because your skill set really applies to nightscape photography. The biggest difference will be, I mean in terms of like the composition and the camera inside out. The biggest difference is now it'll be on a star tracker and long exposure images, where in the daytime at dusk maybe you took a 1 or 2 second exposure. To jump to taking 60, 120 second exposures is a different animal, this low light photography. So a star tracker. Likely the lenses you're already using are great, and the camera, and then just that shift to long exposure images and the image stacking process. No more, capturing an image in one shot or even a stack of 3 or 4. It's capturing 80 2-minute exposures is a bit of a change from the daytime photography world. But yes, I absolutely think that Milky Way and Nightscape style images at those wide angles would be a great place to start.
Okay, here's an interesting question. Do you recommend getting a camera adjusted for astrophotography if you don't use the camera for anything else? Do you recommend doing the modification yourself or sending it elsewhere for a pro to do?
So I'm not going to recommend that anyone takes their camera apart, because I don't want to get blamed if it doesn't turn back on when you put it back together. I modified my first DSLR camera, an old Canon XSI myself, through a great tutorial online. And I was okay with, if I destroyed the camera in the process, it was pretty old, I accepted that. Luckily, it turned out, and the modification to allow more of those reds in the spectrum to come through the camera. But there's a lot of great services that'll do it for you. And maybe have a look on the astronomy classified sites to see if you can get a good deal on one that's already been modified by a professional to get it. If you're really, if you're tech savvy and you feel comfortable taking apart a camera and removing, a small filter that's so breakable with an X-Acto knife, by all means go for it. But yeah, it's, you might be better off leaving that camera and looking for one that's been pre-modified by a professional.
What are your thoughts on the LDAS P3 light pollution filter for more broadband imaging from light polluted areas?
So I believe that's the HuTech IDIS filter, and that's probably the newest light pollution filter. So they do keep getting better, and the challenge always with a light pollution filter like that is that you want to retain the natural colors, and particularly in the stars and those blue hues, while reducing light pollution. That's pretty difficult to do. So I would say I don't know if I've used that exact filter or not. I've used something very similar, and they're great. If you prefer to have an image that starts at a certain way before you process it, one of those filters is great. If you're up to the challenge and task of image processing and knowing that all of the data is in there and all of the color, but it's going to be buried behind all this light pollution you captured too, and these street lamps and everything, then no filter is a better option. But I've always liked light pollution filters, and I've found that they do a very surprisingly great job at producing an acceptable image from the city. But all of them have their limits. I mean, you can only, if you're in a Bortle 8, there's no way, even with a light pollution filter, you're going to be able to take 4 or 5 minute exposures from the city, even with that light pollution filter in there. But experiment. With filters, it always comes down to, you need to use it for a while, see what the data looks like, and process that data and say, okay, is this, am I comfortable processing data that's coming in this way, or should I look elsewhere?
Here's a good one. How do you connect the filters to your Canon camera and telescope?
So there's when you're using a lens, the clip-in filter is good because that sits right underneath the camera lens. You can also use it with a telescope, of course, but they're specific to your exact camera model too. So because they click in right above the camera sensor. So there's those clip-in style filters. But then even more practical, if you're shooting with a telescope, is the threaded, like 2-inch round mounted filters. And those just get threaded into your imaging train. So they'll sit in front of the camera sensor, usually around where the adapter to attach it to your telescope. And they'll just sit in between the imaging train there. But you want to have it, relatively close to that sensor. You might be dealing with stuff like reflections, but the two most common types of filters are the round mounted threaded filters that you thread into the adapter, or the clip-in filters that are inside of the camera body.
Okay, so here's here's a start, someone who wants to start out. If you're going to start putting an astrophotography kit together today, telescope, filters, camera, software, what's a decent budget to expect? In other words, do I buy a new car or do I buy all this stuff?
The million-dollar question. So I recently did a video and a post on AstroBackyard about building a very capable deep sky astrophotography rig for under $2,000. So that's about the ground floor if you want to have, and that was a small star tracker, a very wide field, affordable lens / telescope, and a DSLR camera. So the absolute ground floor, and this is new gear too. You can always, look at the used market. You could probably get that down to say $1,200. But when you're thinking of the camera itself is going to be, $300 or so if it's a used DSLR. The filters could be another $100 or $200. The star tracker is going to be, at least $500. So it really does add up. And of course, that can balloon out of control to $10,000 to $20,000 as you, go further and get larger telescopes and, better cameras and stuff. So yeah, kind of think of around that 1,500 to 2,000 mark if you're really, you really look around and buy used gear. To probably more practical would be, and I hate to say it, around the $5,000 mark, because that's a big number.
Okay. I don't understand this question. Hopefully you will. You will. Are you using NINA? I don't know what that acronym is.
Oh, NINA. Yes. No, I am not, and I probably should be. So NINA is an open source astrophotography image acquisition software that's very, very popular. A lot of great resources online. I'm not personally using it, but I get a slap on the wrist daily from others saying I'm really missing out by not using it. I historically used a software called Astrophotography Tool, APT for short, and NINA is said to be, I think, a bit of an upgrade from that, the things it can do with autofocusing and setting up your image sequence, but there's so many software choices available. NINA is great because a lot of people are using it and there's so many resources for it. So I've heard only good things about that. So if you're starting now and looking in for a software to control your future imaging sessions, NINA is a really great option to consider.
Okay, someone here is asking, apart from subscribing to your YouTube channel, they didn't say that, but of course you're going to. They're asking you, what other YouTube hosts do you admire and recommend that we possibly watch and subscribe?
Oh, okay. So there's a bunch of great ones that come to mind. So for anyone specifically, and it's pretty niche down, but if you want to learn PixInsight, there's a channel called Visible Dark Astro. It's Sean Nielsen, who's one of the best PixInsight educators out there. And he has just so many great tutorials. So I use his videos personally. That's a really good one. Another great breath of fresh air channel is it's called Nebula Photos, and it's hosted by Nico Carver. He's a friend of mine, and he has so much great information for really early beginner level stuff, including like astrophotography without a star tracker or using a basic DSLR, and how to plan your imaging sessions. So Nico Carver of Nebula Photos is another great one that comes to mind. I'm trying to think who else is really good. There's plenty of them. I would say after searching for those two, kind of see who else comes up with those in that realm of videos. And there's a lot of great options there, because it's all about the presenter too, because there's a lot of great information, but it's what's their style, what's their background, are they advanced, are they beginner? So it all depends on where you're at. Oh, and Quiv, the lazy geek, who is in Tokyo on a rooftop. He has a lot of great technical information about the gear because he's a software engineer by trade. So it's very different from my channel because he is so technical from that standpoint, and he's so knowledgeable, and he's able to explain these complex things in a very down-to-earth way. So those are three channels that I personally watch all the time and subscribe to.
We have one more question here for tonight. I have a large aperture telescope, 11-inch Macas. What kind of equipment would I start with? And what could I take pictures of?
So I would recommend, trying planetary astrophotography with a telescope like that, because it's perfect. I don't know if you already own a Barlow or not, but so these smaller planetary cameras, they have these smaller sensors. They're much more affordable than a deep sky camera. And you're basically taking a video, so high frame rates, small sensor of planets in detail, recording a video, and then processing a nice image out of that video data. So definitely I would try planetary solar system photography with a scope like that first. Just because it's so approachable. It's fast frame rates, and the tracking and all that isn't nearly as in depth as it is for deep sky, because deep sky astrophotography through an 11-inch SCT like that at a focal length of probably about 2,800 millimeters, give or take a millimeter, is really demanding on the tracking accuracy, and you really need to. It's a real test of your image tracking, of your equatorial tracking, your auto guiding. All those things are really intensified with a high magnification, big aperture scope like that, but really worth it in the end if you can get it all running smoothly.
Well, Trevor, thank you very much. We had a lot of people online tonight, and you've, I think, got a lot of us all set to go. The chat group is now being filled with thank yous for coming out and spending time with us tonight. So this really has been great. A lot of amazing information, and just a reminder that this will be on our YouTube channel sometime this weekend. So thanks very much, Trevor, and clear skies, and hope you can visit us again sometime.
Thanks so much for having me. It's my pleasure.
Our next meeting is in 2 weeks. Our speaker is Dr. Leah Hirsch. She's just a new astronomer at the University of Toronto, Mississauga, and her talk looks like it's going to be kind of interesting. It's all about the habitability. I have trouble with that word. Habitability of planets in binary star systems. So think of Tatooine and the double stars and Luke Skywalker, and what do we know about planets that are in solar systems with more than one star. So that should be interesting. So that'll be 2 weeks tonight. And apart from that, I want to wish everyone clear skies, stay safe, get your boost, and hope you are successful with taking pictures of the stars. Thanks again, Trevor, and thanks for joining us tonight.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, Trevor. Thanks, Randy.
Thanks, Randy.
Thank you, Trevor.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Good night.
you.
Thanks, Trevor.